You know what's worse than being in a car accident and passing out? Waking up and realizing that while you were lying in the hospital bed, your wife stopped being your wife. My name is Michael, and this is the story of how one night turned my life upside down. What do you think happened next? Listen to the end and you'll know the truth. Before that night, my life was routine, predictable in the best sense of the word. I'm 35 years old, the proud owner of a small but successful auto repair business. Cars have always been my passion, and turning that love into a livelihood felt like a stroke of luck. Having been married to Sarah for 8 years, I believed we had a connection that could withstand anything. Our 6-year-old son, Oliver, was the center of our world, a funny, energetic kid who somehow made every day brighter. Life wasn't bright, but it was ours. Sarah worked as a project manager at a tech company, a job that often required late nights and the occasional call on weekends. I didn't mind. I thought I understood the pressures of her career, and I trusted her completely. We had a rhythm: weekday mornings when Oliver rushed off to school, evenings of family dinners, weekends filled with soccer games, errands, and lazy Sundays. We had a life everyone envied. But looking back, I wonder if I missed the signs. She'd been drifting away from me for months. Little things at first: her phone always face down on the counter, sudden business trips she'd never mentioned before, her laughter fading when we were together. I chalked it up to stress, a phase. She'd never given me a reason to doubt her. Until that night, everything changed. It started like any other night. I was closing up the store when I noticed a car stalled on the side of the road outside my garage. A man in his 20s waved at me. His battery was dead and he didn't have any jumper cables. Helping people get out of traffic was part of my DNA, so I didn't think twice. I grabbed my jumper cables and got to work. That's when it happened: the blinding glare of headlights, the roar of an engine too fast for the wet road, and then nothing. Just darkness. When I opened my eyes 3 days later, the world felt out of order. My head was throbbing, my body was heavy, and the sterile smell of the hospital was nauseating. My brother Ryan was the first person I saw, his worry poorly hidden behind a tight smile. But Sarah wasn't there. Not the first day. Not the second. Not until the fourth. When Sarah finally walked into that hospital room, she wasn't alone. Eric was with her. Her boss. And that's where this story began. When I woke up in that hospital bed, my first instinct was to move, but my body didn't cooperate. A sharp pain shot through my legs, and my chest felt like it was being held down by a boulder. The room smelled sterile, like bleach and plastic, and the beeping of machines was a constant reminder of where I was. It took me a moment to realize what had happened: the headlights, the roar of an engine, and then nothing. The memories came back in flashes, chaotic and disjointed, like pieces of a broken mirror. Ryan was the first face I saw when I opened my eyes. My younger brother. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his hair was disheveled, his hoodie wrinkled, and there were bags under his eyes that weren't usually there. But he managed a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome back, Mike," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You had us worried there for a while." "Sarah." My voice cracked, barely audible. I didn't need to explain the question. He hesitated for just a second, long enough for me to notice. She's been calling to check in. Said she'd come by soon." It didn't sit right with me. Sarah wasn't the type to call from a distance when something serious happened. She'd been the first to rush to my side when I sprained my ankle a few years ago. But now, I'd been in the hospital for days, and she hadn't even shown up. "Where's Oliver?" I asked, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was home with him. Ryan perked up at that, glad for the subject change. "He's good. I saw him yesterday. Mom's been helping out with him, too. Don't stress about that, man. Just focus on getting better." He was dodging the real question, and we both knew it. But I was too exhausted to press. The painkillers kicked in, and soon I was asleep again, drifting in and out over the next couple of days. Each time I woke up, Ryan was there, keeping things light. He brought magazines I didn't care about and told me stories about how Oliver had been talking about dinosaurs nonstop. But he never mentioned Sarah unless I asked, and when I did, the answer was always the same: she's busy. Busy. It became a word I hated. On the fourth day, the door to my hospital room finally opened, and Sarah walked in. For a split second, relief washed over me. She looked beautiful, even in her casual work clothes. Her hair was tied back, and she held a coffee cup in one hand, the same brand she always ordered. But the relief was short-lived. Eric walked in right behind her. He didn't belong there. Not in my hospital room. The sight of him was jarring, like a wrong note in a song I'd heard 1,000 times. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking coat. Everything about him screamed confidence, but not the kind you trust, the kind that hides something. Sarah's face lit up when she saw me. "Michael," she said, rushing to my side. She leaned down and kissed my forehead, her hands brushing over mine. Her touch should have been reassuring, but something felt off. She was too casual, too cheerful, like she was trying to fill the room with energy that didn't match the situation. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her eyes scanning me. "Been better," I muttered, my gaze shifting to Eric, who was hovering awkwardly near the door. She noticed. "Oh. Eric was nice enough to drive me here," she explained quickly. "The car's been acting up again, and I didn't want to risk breaking down." Eric smiled politely, stepping forward. "We've all been worried about you, Michael. Sarah's been keeping me updated every day." "Every day?" My stomach twisted. She hadn't visited me once, but she'd been keeping him updated. I forced a smile. "Appreciate it." Eric lingered for a few more minutes, making small talk that I barely registered. His presence was suffocating, and every time Sarah glanced at him, my unease grew. He left after a while, patting Sarah's shoulder on his way out. It was a casual gesture, but I didn't miss the way she flinched ever so slightly, as if his touch made her uncomfortable, or maybe it was the fact that I'd noticed it. The second he was gone, I turned to her. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Her face softened, and she let out a sigh, as if I'd just asked a question she'd been dreading. "I couldn't leave Oliver alone, Michael. And work's been crazy. You know how it is." "Work." The word came out harsher than I intended. She nodded, avoiding my eyes. "I've been handling everything on my own, and it's just a lot." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, pretending to fiddle with her phone. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to chalk all of this up to bad timing and stress. But something about the way she avoided my eyes made the knot in my chest tighten. "Eric's helping a lot, huh?" I said, testing the waters. Her head snapped up, her expression defensive. "He's just a friend, Michael." He offered to help, and I wasn't going to say no. "Right," I said, though I didn't feel convinced. She stayed for another hour, but the conversation never went deeper. She talked about Oliver's soccer practice, how much he missed me, and how I needed to focus on recovery. But the warmth I'd always felt with her wasn't there. She left before the evening nurse came in, promising to visit again soon. I was discharged from the hospital 5 days later, my body battered but functioning. Ryan had picked me up, cracking jokes the whole drive home, trying to distract me from the gnawing suspicion that had been eating at me since Sarah's visit. He didn't mention her, and I didn't bring her up. What was the point? I'd see her soon enough, and I knew the questions I had wouldn't be answered by my brother's forced optimism. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always, a picture-perfect suburban dream. The white shutters, the trimmed hedges, the swing set in the backyard. It was all there, exactly as I'd left it. But stepping inside felt wrong. The smell was different. Sarah had always kept a vanilla-scented candle burning in the living room, but now the house smelled like the artificial lavender of cleaning supplies, as if someone had been scrubbing away evidence. I shook the thought from my head. Paranoia wasn't going to get me anywhere. But then I noticed the changes. The family photos in the living room, our wedding picture, the one of Oliver at his first birthday party, were gone. In their place were photos of Sarah at corporate events, standing next to her colleagues, her smile polished and professional. On the bookshelf, my repair manuals had been replaced with neat stacks of binders and work portfolios. I wasn't just walking into my home. I was walking into Sarah's home. When Sarah came downstairs, she acted like everything was normal. She hugged me tightly, told me how much Oliver had missed me, and even offered to make my favorite dinner, spaghetti and garlic bread. For a moment, I wanted to believe her, to sink into the comfort of routine and forget the questions gnawing at me. But as I looked around the house, those questions grew louder. That night, while Sarah was tucking Oliver into bed, I found myself wandering through the house, retracing the life we'd built. I ended up in our bedroom. Everything was in its place, my clothes folded in the dresser, my shoes lined up neatly in the closet. But Sarah's nightstand caught my eye. Her phone was charging there, screen down as always. Next to it was a stack of receipts, carelessly stuffed into a small decorative tray. I don't know what possessed me to pick them up, but when I did, my heart sank. The first receipt was for a dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to. The date was a week before my accident, and the total was high enough to suggest it wasn't just a solo meal. The second was for a boutique hotel downtown, a place we'd never stayed at together. The third was for flowers. Not the grocery store kind, but an expensive florist, the kind you'd use to impress someone. I stared at the receipts, my pulse pounding in my ears. My rational mind tried to explain them away. Maybe she'd gone out with colleagues. Maybe the hotel receipt was for a work trip. But deep down, I knew better. The final nail in the coffin came the next day. Sarah had left early for work, leaving Oliver with a neighbor for the morning. The house was quiet, and I had nothing but time and suspicion on my hands. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more I wasn't seeing, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I searched her phone. It wasn't locked. Sarah wasn't the type to bother with passwords. My hands trembled as I opened her messages, scrolling past harmless chats with friends and family. And then I found the thread with Eric. My breath caught in my throat. The messages were intimate. Not explicit, but personal in a way that made my stomach churn. There were inside jokes, pet names, and a string of texts from the night of my accident. Eric, I hate that you're stressed. Wish I could hold you right now. Sarah, I wish you could too. I'll call when I'm home. Need your voice. I scrolled further, my chest tightening with every word. They'd been texting constantly for months, the tone shifting from professional to something much deeper. Sarah, thank you for being my rock. I don't know what I'd do without you. Eric, you deserve so much more than you're getting. I put the phone down, my hands shaking. There was no denying it anymore. The receipts, the texts, the distance I'd felt from her for months, it all pointed to the same conclusion. My wife wasn't just distant. She was gone, at least emotionally. I didn't confront her that day. I didn't know how to start, and honestly, I wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses she'd come up with. Instead, I spent the rest of the afternoon replaying our life together, searching for the moment when everything had started to fall apart. Was it gradual? Was there a single moment where I could have stopped it? The house was quiet that evening, but my mind wasn't. Every word from those texts echoed in my head like a storm I couldn't escape. I'll call when I'm home. Need your voice. Who was this woman? Was she really the same Sarah who used to dance with me in the kitchen at midnight, who cried tears of joy when we brought Oliver home from the hospital? Sarah, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled. Yeah. I stayed standing, arms crossed. We need to talk. Her smile faltered. Okay. What about? I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out where to start, how to lay out everything I'd found without losing my temper or breaking down. But when I saw her glance nervously at her phone, almost like she was expecting something, I couldn't hold back anymore. Are you sleeping with Eric? The words came out flat, like a question I already knew the answer to. Her face froze, her expression a mix of shock and denial. What? No. Michael, why would you even ask that? I stepped closer, feeling my voice rise despite myself. Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw the texts. I saw the receipts. Dinner, flowers, a hotel. Are you seriously going to sit there and tell me it's all in my head? Her face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it again. But then something shifted. She slumped back against the couch, her shoulders sagging like the weight of her secrets had finally caught up with her. It's not what you think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then tell me what it is, I shot back, my anger boiling over. Tell me why you've been sneaking around, texting him things you should only be saying to me. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it wasn't enough to quiet the storm raging inside me. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said finally, her voice cracking. It just did. "I've been so unhappy, Michael. You're always working, always at the shop. And Eric, he listens. He's there for me in a way you haven't been." I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Unhappy? Since when? You never said anything. You never gave me a chance to fix it." She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "I didn't know how to say it. I didn't want to hurt you. But things have been different for a long time. I thought maybe if I just ignored it, it would get better. But then Eric." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. "And then Eric showed up and made it worse," I said bitterly. "You had an affair, Sarah. Don't dress it up like it was something noble." Her tears came faster now, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "It wasn't physical," she said quickly. "I swear. It never got that far. I wouldn't do that to you, Michael." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think that makes it better? You think I care whether or not you've slept with him? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, confiding in him instead of me. You don't think that's betrayal?" She didn't answer. She just sat there, crying silently, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. I walked away, pacing the kitchen, trying to get a grip on my spiraling emotions. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But I couldn't do any of that, not with Oliver asleep upstairs. After what felt like an eternity, I turned back to her. She was still sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Her head snapped up, and she shook it violently. "No. Of course not. I love you, Michael." I never stopped. "You don't betray someone you love," I said coldly. She stood up, stepping toward me, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said. "Don't try to fix this with words. I don't want to hear it." "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Let's go to counseling. Let's try to work through this. I made a mistake, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." Her words hung in the air, but they felt hollow. I didn't trust her anymore, and I didn't know if I ever could again. "You already lost me," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "You just didn't notice until now." The morning after our confrontation, the house felt heavier than ever. Sarah's footsteps on the stairs, the clink of dishes in the kitchen, even Oliver's laughter, it all sounded distant, muffled under the weight of what I'd discovered. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't ready to face the day. When I finally made my way downstairs, Sarah was at the stove making pancakes for Oliver. She looked up when I entered, her eyes swollen and red from a night spent crying. For a moment, she opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but I shook my head and gave her a look that stopped her in her tracks. Oliver greeted me with his usual cheer, holding up a plate smeared with syrup. "Dad. Look, I made a dinosaur out of my pancake." I forced a smile for him, ruffling his hair. "That's awesome, buddy." It was a fragile performance, trying to act normal for Oliver's sake while the foundation of my marriage crumbled beneath us. I went through the motions that morning, helped him get ready for school, packed his backpack, and kissed him goodbye when Sarah drove him to the neighbor's carpool. But the second she left, the mask dropped. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of pancakes she'd left behind. The smell turned my stomach. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't breathe in this house that no longer felt like home. The silence pressed down on me, and I realized I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through town until I found myself parked outside my shop. The garage was my sanctuary, the one place where everything made sense. Machines didn't lie. Engines didn't betray you. I spent the next few hours pretending to work, tinkering with an old Mustang I'd been restoring for a client. But my mind wasn't on the car. It was on Sarah, on Eric, on the texts and receipts. On the betrayal. By the time I got back home, it was late afternoon. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, but she wasn't scrolling this time. She was waiting for me. "We need to talk," she said softly, standing as I walked in. "I thought we talked last night," I replied, brushing past her. Michael, please. Her voice cracked, and I stopped, reluctantly turning to face her. She was trembling, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. I told Eric it's over, she said quickly, like she needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. I told him I can't talk to him anymore, that I need to focus on us, on our family. That's supposed to fix this? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Because it doesn't, Sarah. It doesn't undo what you've already done. I know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I swear, Michael, it wasn't physical. It never got that far. It was just emotional. I felt alone, and Eric was there. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Do you even hear yourself? It was just emotional. You don't think that's worse? You gave him the part of you that was supposed to be mine. She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she crumpled onto the couch, her head in her hands. I don't know how to fix this, she sobbed. I stood there, staring at her, my anger warring with the years of love and history we shared. I wanted to yell, to demand answers she couldn't give, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. You can't fix this, I said finally. You can't undo what you've done. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for it. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. What about Oliver? She asked, her voice trembling. Are we just going to rip his world apart? Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Oliver. I'd been so consumed with my own pain that I hadn't even thought about how this would affect him. He deserved better than this. Better than two parents who couldn't figure their shit out. I don't know, I admitted. But I can't keep living like this, Sarah. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. She nodded, wiping at her tears. Will you at least try? For him. For us. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't have an answer for her. Not yet. The first step was hiring a lawyer. I wasn't ready to file for divorce, not yet, but I needed someone in my corner, someone who could guide me through the storm if it came to that. Her name was Claire Hamilton, and from the moment I walked into her office, I knew she wasn't someone who messed around. Michael, she said after I laid everything out, her tone professional but firm. Before we talk about next steps, I need to ask you a serious question. What do you want? Are you looking to save this marriage, or are you ready to end it? I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't know. Part of me wanted to fight for our family, for Oliver's sake. But another part, the part that replayed her texts with Eric over and over in my head, wanted to burn it all down. I don't know yet, I admitted. But I need leverage. I need to protect myself if things get messy. Claire nodded, sliding a notepad across her desk. Then we start with gathering evidence. Bank statements, emails, anything that shows a pattern of dishonesty. And if you suspect this Eric guy has crossed a line, we might need to involve his workplace. It could affect custody and division of assets. Her words hit me like a splash of cold water. Custody. Assets. The practicalities of divorce had always felt like something that happened to other people, not me. But here I was, sitting in a lawyer's office, preparing for a war I never wanted to fight. That evening, I went through every corner of our house, looking for more clues. Her purse, her desk, her laptop, it felt wrong, invading her privacy like this, but what choice did I have? I found more receipts, more messages, more proof that she'd been living a life I wasn't a part of. But the real breakthrough came when I logged into her email. It wasn't hard, she'd been using the same password for years. At first, it was just the usual stuff, work emails, newsletters, school updates about Oliver. But buried in a folder labeled miscellaneous was a chain of emails between her and Eric. They weren't as careful in their emails as they'd been in their texts. One subject line read, "Miss you already." Another, "Last night was perfect." I scrolled through them, my chest tightening with every line. The messages were flirtatious, but they also hinted at something deeper. Inside jokes, shared memories, and one that made my blood run cold. "Eric, you were right to be cautious at the hospital. Michael's sharper than you think. Be careful." They'd been planning this. Coordinating their lies. Every moment I'd spent wondering if I was imagining things, they'd been laughing behind my back. The next day, I followed Sarah. I waited until she left for work, then trailed her car from a distance. I felt ridiculous, like some B-movie detective, but I had to know. She didn't go to work. She went to Eric's house. I stayed in the car, parked a few houses down, watching as she walked up to his door and let herself in without knocking. They were inside for nearly 2 hours before she came back out, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression calm, like nothing had happened. That was it. The last shred of doubt I'd been holding onto was gone. The following week, I made my move. I contacted Eric's company's HR department anonymously, providing them with the evidence I'd found. Emails, texts, the receipts, all of it pointed to an inappropriate relationship between a manager and his subordinate. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but I didn't care. If Eric thought he could wreck my marriage and walk away unscathed, he was dead wrong. A few days later, I got my answer. Sarah came home from work, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Michael," she said, barely able to meet my eyes. "They fired Eric." I didn't say anything, just nodded and went back to the paper I'd been pretending to read. "Did you?" she started, but she couldn't finish the question. I folded the paper, looking her dead in the eye. "Actions have consequences, Sarah. You should have thought about that before you let him into our lives." She broke down, sobbing on the couch, but I felt nothing. Whatever guilt I might have felt had been burned away by weeks of betrayal and lies. That night, I started sleeping in the guest room. I couldn't stand being near her, couldn't bear the thought of sharing a bed with someone who'd betrayed me so completely. Every time I looked at her, all I saw was Eric. Oliver, bless him, didn't seem to notice the shift. He was too young to understand, and Sarah and I both worked hard to keep things normal for him. But I knew it was only a matter of time before he started asking questions. I wasn't sure where to go from here. Divorce was starting to feel inevitable, but I wasn't ready to pull the trigger. Not yet. Not until I had everything in place to protect myself and Oliver. Sarah, for her part, seemed to be trying. She stopped texting Eric, at least as far as I could tell, and started suggesting counseling again. But it all felt hollow, like she was doing it out of obligation, not genuine remorse. The weeks that followed were an emotional battlefield. Sarah insisted we try counseling, and for a while, I agreed, if only to convince myself I was doing everything possible for Oliver. We sat in a beige office with a therapist named Margaret, who had kind eyes and a voice like honey. She'd ask us questions, and Sarah would cry, apologizing for everything, swearing she still loved me. But for all her tears, nothing she said could undo the damage. Every time she spoke, I'd picture her walking into Eric's house. Margaret tried to get me to open up, but I couldn't. How do you talk about trust when it's been shattered into a million pieces? After a few sessions, I stopped going. "This isn't fixing anything," I told Sarah one evening as we sat in the living room, the silence between us deafening. Her eyes were glassy, her hands trembling in her lap. "Michael, I'm trying. Can't you see that?" "You're trying because you got caught," I said, my voice cold. "Not because you care about fixing us. If you did, you wouldn't have destroyed us in the first place." She didn't respond. She just looked away, and in that moment, I knew it was over. I filed for divorce the next day. Claire, my lawyer, was ready. She'd been gathering evidence, documenting everything, the texts, the emails, the receipts. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Oliver. When Sarah was served the papers, she broke down completely. She begged me to reconsider, to think about Oliver, to give her another chance. "This doesn't have to be the end, Michael," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "It already is," I said, my voice steady.